introduce our speaker, our keynote speaker, which is Kumar Garg. Kumar is a Senior Director for Technology and Society at Schmidt Futures, where his portfolio includes 4 core areas of work: investing in data collaboratives that address concrete societal problems, expanding the number of people that are involved in discovery and innovation, investing in large risk capital in nascent university research, in high potential people and young organizations, and to advance public policy that sustains and leverages science and technology. Kumar helped science and technology policy for nearly 8 years while serving at the OSTP of the Obama administration. And he was instrumental to bolster STEM education, including an initiative, Educate to Innovate, with more than $1 billion in-kind and philanthropic investment that went to that initiative. He was instrumental in the creation of the Grand Challenges Scholars Program commitment letter by more than 120 engineering deans that met in this building here back in 2015 and culminated in a letter that was sent to President Obama at that time and was delivered at the White House by President Mode. Kumar received a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a law degree from Yale Law School. So please join me in welcoming Kumar at the podium.
Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, that's good. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be back with all of you. I will say that we're like Kool-Aid drinkers on the Grand Challenge Scholars Program. I think, the program's start and its growth happened a lot during the Obama years, and we basically used every excuse we could find to have the program over. And so I still remember, I forgot which, pretty early in the Obama administration that we had almost 100 engineering deans over, and the president dropped by. And the way staff always works when you report to the president is you try to look for his energy afterwards, and he's like, we should do more of that. They like fixing things. So engineers always did well in the Obama White House. So my goal really to be here is to do a couple of things. The first, and this is the best part, I sent my slides earlier, and they're like, did you have the order wrong? Starting with thank you. But I actually like to start with thank you because I actually think that the folks who are in this room actually represent the community organizers for what engineering could look like in the future, which is you're working on your campuses to actually start and grow these programs. That's hard work. It comes out of all the other things you have to do, whether it's the trio that helped start this program or the folks that have brought it to more campus. Every time I hear about the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, it's passionate students and faculty that are helping it grow, the business leaders that help build these partnerships. So, this is a real community effort. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge how much the program has grown, and it's grown really because of your work on the ground. The part that I really want to focus in on, so I served in the Obama administration for 8 years, and it's been interesting, the new political environment that we have all entered into. And I think, and I wanted to sort of go into a little bit of this, that programs like the Grand Challenge Scholars Program are now more important than ever. It's global orientation, the fact that you actually are bringing people and students from around the world and creating opportunities for them to work together. The fact that you're actually thinking about solutions. I don't know if you watch TV, but we don't spend that much as a country talking about solutions. And the fact that engineers have a systems approach, and they think about how individual components all connect together. So I think the program leaves me incredibly inspired. So a couple of things as to why I think the push to have the Grand Challenge Scholars Program grow and thrive matters more than ever. So I just want to go through a couple of those things. So when I take a step back and I say, if Tom and Richard and Giannis were sitting today and saying, what are the reasons why something like the Grand Challenge Scholars Program should exist? I think the evidence and the reasons are actually stronger today than they were even 10 years ago. So the first is, I think if you look at what students are talking about when they arrive on campus, what they talk about when they're leaving campus, what they talk about when they're in their early jobs is there's a huge desire for social impact. It drives, surveys show this, and I think our institutions are struggling with this idea because they're saying, we're in the skill building business. You will figure out your social impact later. All the times students will tell me, the advice I get is to hunker down and maybe when I'm 40, I'll get to use my skills on something important. And I just don't think that works as an idea. So I think the Grand Challenge Scholars, by putting the things that we're going to work on together front and center, actually are important to a really important student desire. The second part is that I think all the research around the science of learning shows that it's a hands-on learning where we develop all our skills. And this kind of sounds intuitive, but then I think we just don't teach that way. So one common problem that people always talk about in K-12 education is, it's how did we end up with the 300-page textbook, right? It's like every subpart of every discipline says, we need our chapter. And it's, the food fight is bad, and so we just add chapters. And so I don't know if you remember taking American history back in high school, and then you could just kind of stop at 1920. You just don't even get to the 20th century because there's just too much content for everyone to cover. Well, this happens all the time. For lots of reasons, we say we should be doing hands-on when we actually just cram in more and more content because we feel like we have to see ourselves in the material. So I think this idea of being hands-on, which the engineering community really gets, is so important because what's that common adage, right? There's planning, and then there's when planning meets reality, which is you actually try to go out there in the world and you try to do it. And so I really like the Confucius quote that President Mo talked about last night, which is, I do and I understand. So lots of the research, this was behind the Common Core standards, shows the importance of hands-on learning. The third reason is I think that we're in a sea change when it comes to the role that computation and computer science and computing, whether it's the rise of AI and machine learning, is having on across all disciplines. And increasingly, you're starting to find that these methodologies are spreading, whether it's in biotechnology, whether it's in the social sciences, and it's raising this question about how do we build more integrated disciplines. But I think the Grand Challenge Scholars Program is jumping ahead because we can't actually figure out on the front end what are going to be all the interdisciplinary needs, and actually students can point the way. One of the examples Tom Cleal, who I worked with in the Obama White House, always gives is he started this idea called Big Ideas at Berkeley, which was a program that gave really small grants to students at Berkeley on new ideas. And he said often the ideas the students would come up with on, we want a student nanotechnology initiative, would often end up being a couple years ahead of the major research initiatives that the faculty would have, which is the students where their actual interest for integrating disciplines was actually a leading indicator of where the fields might be going. The fourth reason I would give as to why this is actually increasing is that, Giannis sort of touched on this as well, which is I actually think that kind of divorcing the impact of our work with the work has big impact, has real challenges when it comes to the equity side. It has a big impact. One of the big lessons that we've learned with the launch of the new computer science AP course, which took computer science from something that about 30,000 kids took to 130,000 in the past year, has been the real emphasis on social impact. And how do we make sure that we actually lead with social impact matters a lot. And then the final thing that I'll say that I think the Grand Challenge Program really thinks about is one of the things I learned from working in the White House was that a systems approach, but an all-hands-on-deck approach is how we often solve problems. That we don't actually solve problems by saying, I'm just going to figure out this one piece of it, and I'll just leave everything else to chance, and maybe somebody will come along and pick up that idea. The way we actually solve problems is try to think about everybody that needs to be involved. And thinking about big problems and then getting involved has a big part of that. So I think the part that I wanted to sort of work through with you, and we'll have time for questions, is really the movement building part. If we think this is really important, we think that the past 10 years have shown the real potential for this and the need is as great as ever. How do we make sure Grand Challenge scholars and the mindset of Grand Challenge Scholars is a model that can come to every school that wants it, to every student that wants it. And this is something that I think NAE is thinking about, but I think all of you are part of this conversation as well. So what I wanted to just sort of do is, in this conversation, just sort of talk you through how we would sometimes approach these big questions when we were in the Obama White House. So these are just two moments that sort of captured this sort of scenario planning exercise. The picture at the bottom was super early in my tenure. That's me nervously sitting there. After we had, this was a planning exercise after the president had given a big speech here at the National Academies on putting science and engineering in its rightful place at the center of our policymaking process. But then the question was, like, what are we going to actually do about that? Because it's one thing to say that, then it's how do we build a plan? And so this was the meeting that we had where we had developed the Educate to Innovate campaign, which was really an effort to work with all the professional societies, all companies in a range of industries, the federal agencies and others, to say this really has to be an all hands on deck effort. And we were sort of reporting. The other image is right before the president wrote the first line of code, and I'm there with Megan Smith, who you'll hear from later today. And that led to the Computer Science for All initiative that the president announced in the final State of the Union. But in both instances, we took this big idea of how do we get our kids ready and really tried to approach it from an all hands on deck effort. And so as some folks sort of heard in the bio, we sort of did this all the time, where we said, okay, how do we get more teachers ready? Well, let's think about a big, hairy goal and then work backwards. How do we get more computer science into more schools? How do we think about a computer science for all effort? How do we think about more broadband for schools? So how could we do this same method in thinking about Grand Challenge Scholars for every school and student that wants it? So one thing that we often did in sort of breaking down these sort of things is we kept like kind of a tactics board. So this used to sit above my office. And this is the way that our team used to sort of problem solve on this question of how do you build these big, hairy coalitions. So I just want to go through some of the big ideas that we would always use to sort of organize ourselves. And then I'd be curious to get your thoughts on what you would do with this, as well as what should be on that to-do list. So the first one is, and all of these will, on one level, will sound kind of obvious and a little trite, but they actually helped us in being able to organize large coalitions. So the first one is, think of the end at the beginning, which I think is a really important moment for us to take. So we are at 10 years of this program, whether it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now, what would be a really important stretch goal that the community wants to set for itself that could really drive its work? And I think that's powerful, and in both level setting for its exposure on the number of campuses that it could be at, in the number of students who could get it, in the way that the program can evolve. So what should be our collective goal that could really drive and inspire? And often, we often said for setting that goal, it has to have a number and a date. So that's at least one place to start. The second thing that we always said was, actually, too often people jump immediately into what is it that is directly under their control. So if we were working in the government, or now that I'm working in philanthropy, you would say, well, the government, we could ask the federal agencies to do something, or build it into the next budget, or we could give a specific grant on it. But I actually think that jumps the gun. Too often, we don't actually sit down and say, actually, let's build out an imagine if list of everyone who could get involved. So if we actually have a vision for every student getting this opportunity, what's the role that the largest engineering firms and companies could play? What's the role that professional societies can play? What's the role that individual scientists and engineers can play? What's the role that students can play in advancing this? And if you actually start to do X does Y with actual nouns, and you said, I'm not saying we can convince them to do it, but let's just write down our imagine if list. The amazing thing is, once you actually write that list down, somebody will say, oh, I know the CEO of that company. I think they would be really excited. But you won't get there if you don't actually write down the list. So what is that imagine if list if we're going to really build a movement on this? The third thing that we always said was, we self-assign ourselves too much of the work. We say, well, I thought this up, or I'm really passionate about it. I'm just going to go do it. But actually, the biggest and hardest and most important things we do together. And the best part of it is you can kind of tell who's interested in helping you because they're the ones who rush up and say, I'm really passionate about it. And rather than saying, well, once we have a plan, we're going to loop back with you, actually get them involved. And so there's lots of doers all around you. And so I think finding those doers is really powerful. You've got Grand Challenge Scholars alumni that, like Michaela, that created the National Science Policy Network. When Michaela called me a year and a half ago, she said, oh, well, I'm really passionate about how students can give more to science policy. I was like, hey, that's amazing. What kind of help do you need? And in the past just year, they have created a national network with more than 50 campuses, and they're off and running. And that's the work of a handful of students that are working on their own with not that much support. So I think incredible things can happen. There's a woman that works with me, Julia Delk. I don't know if Julia is here, who's doing lots of work and going around campus to campus and trying to figure out what are ways that campuses can step up and help more students get access to these CS for good, engineering for good opportunities. So find those doers around you and actually ask them how they can contribute their time. And I would say Rama and Randy and a lot of the NAE staff are great allies in this work. The fourth thing we always said was, rather than being overwhelmed, we all walk through life feeling like we have 150% of things to do than we have time. And so we sort of walk in this kind of cognitive overload mode. But actually, we always said to our people, the schedule is actually your friend. The president has to give a speech sometime in the future. We have to get grants out the door. The fact that we have to do things actually creates the context for us to do these big, ambitious goals. So there will be another NAE Grand Challenges meeting. There will be this meeting in a year. There will be lots of opportunities for this community to say, we can actually mark future progress. So what could we collectively work on so that we would have an incredible update on where this community is in a year from now or in 3 years from now? And that's actually how, a lot of the work around the engineering dean's letter came together, which was, the Grand Challenge Scholars Program was growing, and the leadership in this room said, hey, could we actually use the fact that we could actually send a letter to President Obama as the context for a lot more deans and a lot more schools to step up? And I think they were surprised by how much work it got done, which was people wanted to be in the letter, and then we had Michaela and President Moat and others actually present the letter to the president, and that was a 6-month process that got a couple years of work done. And so that was the schedule of, hey, we want to present this to the president, actually doing a lot of work. So what are the moments that are coming up that can actually help you drive this work? And then finally, I think moments like this are really important, which is you don't get to build a community without taking stock of all the really important work that has happened. And I think NAE, the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, is a real example of years of work coming together. So I think celebrating the people who have helped contribute to it, as well as the work itself, is really important. So those are the 5 big things that we always sort of said, and I would love, both in the Q&A after and elsewhere, to just continue to engage with this community about how we make this an opportunity for even more students. So let me end there and focus on your questions. I will call on people. It's a quiet group. We can do hands if people are scared of standing up. Yes, Dean Pines.
Hi, Kumar.
Hi.
Daryl Pines, Dean of Engineering at University of Maryland. You were in the Obama administration. How can we take this idea to the current administration and get their active advocacy, as you were, for this wonderful program going forward? So how do we do it? No, it's a hard question.
Yeah. So I get this question a lot, actually. I would say there's two things. I think one is the federal government is 2 million people, right? So it's actually pretty big. Even when we were serving, I always used to say that what happens on TV does not correspond that closely to the day-to-day work of the federal agencies. And so if you just sort of get 1 to 2 levels down into the federal agencies, for some of them, it's actually pretty hard in the current environment because it's pretty political. But for lots of them, they're operating. I think the hardest thing for them was the first few months, where they were used to a very close, active relationship with the political leadership that sat above them. And for a while, those spots were unfilled, and in some positions are still unfilled. So I think one is just like remembering that with congressional support, a lot of the agencies are proceeding ahead. And so I've heard from a lot of agencies where a lot of their programs are people aren't applying. They're like reading the headlines and saying, oh, maybe the Department of Education doesn't give out grants anymore. That's not true. It's giving out the same grants that it gave out when we were there. So one is actually reaching out to the senior career servants, civil servants who are there and working with them. I think at the political level, I think it's important to know what your goals are. So I think it is important to say, well, are we looking for opportunities to get the program on everyone's radar? I think that's useful. I think there's no harm, but I think my general advice is to not assume that the same amount of sort of media visibility would happen if you sort of engage them directly in the same ways. That's my charitable answer. Anybody else? Yes, sir. I can always amplify your question. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. One of the things I noticed is there was a lot of discussion about K-12. In order to meet the needs of our students in college, it needs to, things need to start much earlier. I was a program director of the National Science Foundation also, and this discussion came up because, students are not consumers anymore. They are producers of information. So how early do you have to actually go back to these initiatives? Because I think the transition from K-12 to college needs a big paradigm shift to actually think like this, actually. So there's a few schools that are starting to implement this type of broader idea of competencies rather than just focusing on content. So how early do you think this should start?
I think it's a great question. You've got Dean Pines in the room, who has been championing an effort to bring AP Engineering to high school, which I think would be a huge effort over time. I remember one of our earliest meetings in the White House where we brought together, this is after the president gave this speech, we brought together heads of, the business community, so everybody from the BRT to the National Governors Association and elsewhere, and this big debate sort of broke out, which is, what are all of the things that need to get figured out? And then finally someone raised their hand and said, what about prenatal? And which is true, right? But I think I sort of have an and approach to policy, which is that even though all these things are fit together, and so you have to actually think about them comprehensively as a system, you can still thrust a lot of positive energy on key points that matter a lot. So I think part of what the Grand Challenge Scholars Program is doing is it is tackling this question around what is it that we think students are at university for in a really comprehensive and interesting way. But I totally agree that the K-12 system is going through this big period of transition. I think there's a lot of potential for change. People sometimes underestimate. So if somebody had said to you 5 years ago, hey, where do you think computer science will be in high school? They would have said, well, high school is kind of, people will give you the usual, high school looks the same way it looked like 100 years ago, that sort of, and actually, you've had a 5x increase in the number of students that are taking and passing AP Computer Science. Why is that happening? It's because a set of folks actually set out to understand that system and then try to systematically transform it. So I think when it comes to engineering and actually giving students these hands-on experiences, we can do it, but I think it will take us, pretty specifically getting involved. And I think the movement around AP engineering could be part of it.
Here.
Sir?
Kumar, you went by Andrew Reynolds at the University of Virginia. You went by your slide of the Obama initiatives pretty quickly, the 100,000 STEM
Yes.
teachers, for example. I wonder if you might go back and just look at that slide again and take us through it and show us or tell us a progress report from those
I don't know if I can still work it.
If you can get back there. And the
I
second
don't
thing
know.
is,
Yes, let me see if I can do it.
couldn't agree more wholeheartedly
Oh.
with you. There you are.
Yes.
And maybe you could give us a sense of the momentum that's in those programs.
Yeah.
But I couldn't agree more as a former civil servant that really you can appeal to the second and third tiers in the civil service, in the executive branch. And really, this Grand Challenges Scholars Program is the way to do that, by populating those places with these energetic students of the 21st century.
Right,
So
right.
I wonder if you might just give us a status report.
Yeah,
So
no,
we might really see that there is something the Trump administration can embrace
Yeah,
that's already in
yeah.
place.
No, I think that's a great exercise. So for example, the STEM teacher goal, I think, is a great example of what advanced planning can do. So this came out of a 2006 Rising Above Gatherings from National Academies report. Then the President Council of Advisors in Science and Tech reissued that recommendation, only they made it into a 10-year goal. So instead of 10,000 teachers a year, 100,000 over 10. That was then, we announced that in the 2011 State of the Union. We put a budget proposal against it. But what was most surprising was that because we started to work with the sort of external groups, now more than 400 organizations have made commitments against this goal, and they've actually gotten more than 40,000 teachers trained under this goal. So we are actually on track from when the goal was announced to the 10-year mark on being able to meet the goal. We were eventually able to put some federal funds against it, but it's actually a lot of private investment and local investment that's driving the goal. So that one is on the on track part. White House Science Fair is in abeyance. The Computer Science for All initiative, we were able to make a ton of progress in 2016 when we announced it, but that momentum has actually continued to grow. So the number of organizations that are working on Computer Science for All has tripled. The number of governors that have taken specific policy action has gone up. So that one continues to grow, even in our absence. It's been embraced by the new administration under a different name. And broadband, so under the FCC's new broadband rules, there's been more than $10 billion of investment towards broadband, towards K-12, and that's meant that 20 million kids already have access to high-speed broadband in their schools because of the initiative. And unless there's a change in policy, that will mean by 2020, we'll be able to get to basically 99% high-speed broadband in K-12 schools. So that, I wouldn't say a perfect scorecard, but because we were able to build these as large coalitions working together, they were not purely dependent on the federal government acting. On the question on, can these students actually serve in government, I'm a huge believer in that. I think, these sort of, whether it's a AAAS fellowship and other fellowship programs that give engineers and scientists the opportunity to serve. I came into government on a fellowship program, or other things. I think they both bring new ideas and energy into these conversations. And so I would definitely encourage all of you to apply, and if you don't know anything about these programs, go talk to Michaela. Great. Anybody else? Awesome.